One of the more telling behaviors that people exhibit is how they react to things. You know, when faced with a situation, all of us have different responses to things. We react in different manners. You know, when people are faced with harm or danger or threatened, they say there are two different reactions: fight or flight. You either stay and fight the battle, or you take off and get out of harm's way. And the way we react to things is oftentimes based upon our upbringing, our experiences, our age, the things we've gone through, what we've learned, what we've seen in our lives. You know, when we encounter something new or something foreign, we have different reactions depending on what's gone on in our lives. I remember being in a junior high shop classroom. First day of class, and the instructor came and he took all of us around the room and showed us all this cool stuff we were going to get to do. You know, all the different machines, the welders and the cutters and all this kind of thing. And when he got all done, he brought us back and he sat us down in our chairs and he explained, he said, "I love to give a tour on the first day of class." And he said, "You know, y'all thought you were getting to see all this stuff." He said, "But I got to observe who was really interested. Because when we get somewhere, the ones that were really interested, you know, were trying to work their way up to front, and they wanted to see and all that. While some of us who were not so interested in being in that class were looking out the window or looking at the clock, trying to figure out how long until lunch and things like that." And he said, "I can tell by how you react who's really interested." And he said, "And therefore, I can tell who's probably going to do really good in this class because you're interested in it." See, some of us reacted one way and some the other, but we all react differently. The same thing happens to people around the world today, and it's happened to people around the world for eternity. They react in different ways to the same event. As we continue our study in the life of Christ this morning, we're going to see that the news of the birth of Jesus, the birth of the long-awaited Messiah, caused different reactions to different people. We're so familiar with the birth story. We go over it every Christmas. We just finished up with that, and we know all about the little town in Bethlehem, and no room at the inn, and the manger, and the shepherds, and the angels. And we know all about that story. What a beautiful night it was. The newborn baby, the loving parents, the majesty and the beauty of that night. And his birth that causes a joyous reaction to all those who came to see him. It was a wonderful night. After Jesus had been born, after the days of purification for Mary, she had a time when after giving birth she was considered ceremonially unclean. And remember from last week, after that time had passed, they took Jesus to the temple and presented him, dedicated him there. And we looked at all of that. But after all of that has happened, there are some other visitors that come and have reaction to his birth. And that's what we're going to look at this morning. We will be in Matthew chapter 2. In Matthew 2, we get the announcement of the visit of these guys called the wise men from the east. And we get the questions and concerns from the king of the area, Herod. And they have dramatically different reactions to his birth. So we're going to look at their story, beginning in verse 1 of Matthew chapter 2. "Now after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea in the days of Herod the king, Magi from the east arrived in Jerusalem, saying, 'Where is he who has been born King of the Jews? For we saw a star in the east and have come to worship him.'" Wise men from the east. We don't know exactly who these guys were or exactly where they came from. We know they came from the east. They're called Magi. And the Greek historian Herodotus identified Magi as a group of men who performed a priestly function in the Media-Persian Empire. That sounds a little familiar. Remember in the book of Daniel, when the king had the dream and he wanted to know what it meant, he called in his wise men. Included in that group were these astrologers, and times they're called sorcerers. They were wise men that he came and he inquired of, and as we know, when they couldn't give him the answer, Daniel stepped up and gave him the answer. Their exact place of origin, their exact role is unknown, but what we do know is that they were students of the night sky because they see something. They see a star that leads them, and they follow this star. Now, perhaps, if you'll remember, Israel had been taken captive several hundred years earlier, first by the Assyrians and then by the Babylonians, and they had taken a lot of the people over to the east, to Assyria, to Babylon. Maybe these guys had heard the stories. Maybe they had heard these Hebrew people talking about their Messiah, this one that was supposed to come. Maybe they'd heard about that over the years. They had told the story to their families and passed it on down. Maybe they were aware of that. I don't know. We don't know exactly how much they knew or exactly where they knew about it. But we do know that when they saw the star, they followed because they had been informed somehow the star represented this king that had been born. They follow, it says they desired to worship the one that the star had led them to. They get to Jerusalem, and they're asking where to find this one the star had pointed them to. They said, "Where is he?" They come and they want to find him. They want to be near him. They ask, where do I find Messiah? Think about that for a minute. Wouldn't that be wonderful if somebody walked up to you tomorrow and said, "Can you tell me how to find Jesus?" Wouldn't you love that opportunity? That's what these guys, they say, "Can you tell me where the Messiah is?" They want to know about him. And it said they had come to worship him. They're filled with expectation, with anticipation. They're filled with joy. And they have come to worship. That's the first type of response. The first response we see in Matthew 2 is one of worship. A response filled with the desire to get closer to Messiah, to search him out, to find him, to want to be in his presence. And they've traveled a long way. Remember, this is 1st century AD Israel. They traveled by foot or maybe by animal. They didn't get on the first plane. They didn't have any quick way to get there. We don't know how long this journey took. It may have taken weeks. It may have taken months. Might have taken up to a year. It's a long journey, but they make it. They come because it's worth it to them. They have come to worship. What a great response to the Messiah. But as we continue in Matthew, we're going to see there is a different response. In verse 3, it says, "When Herod the king heard this, he was troubled, and all Jerusalem with him. Gathering together all the chief priests and scribes of the people, he inquired of them where the Messiah was to be born. They said, 'In Bethlehem of Judea, for this is what has been written by the prophet.'" And he gives this prophecy of Micah chapter 5 that we look at every Christmas about the little town of Bethlehem. And you, Bethlehem, land of Judah, are by no means least among the leaders of Judah, for out of you shall come forth a ruler who will shepherd my people Israel. Then Herod secretly called the Magi and determined from them the exact time the star appeared. And he sent them to Bethlehem and said, Go and search carefully for the child, and when you have found him, report to me, so that I too may come and worship him. Herod's response is, he says he's troubled by the news that these wise men are seeking the Messiah. Why? Remember who Herod was? Herod was the king of Judea. He was in a position of power and influence over the Jewish people. And he'd like to be worshiped too. He was the top dog, so he thought. And he's not going to like the idea that they're coming to worship someone other than him. See, he's king. He wants all the attention. And Herod was pretty ruthless. He didn't like any threat to his throne. In fact, he was so bad, do you know he killed his wife and 2 of his own sons because they were a threat, he perceived, someone who might take the throne from him. He doesn't want to share his glory with anyone. And when confronted with the information, he puts into action a plan to eliminate the threat. And that's what we're going to look at here in a little bit. He says he calls the priests and the scribes, the ones who knew the Jewish scriptures. That's where they get this quote from Micah. He wants to know where Messiah is going to be born. And then it says he inquires of the Magi when the star appeared. So Herod, to eliminate the threat, he wants to know where, and he wants to know when. And if he can narrow that down, he can find out precisely where, to him, the enemy is. And that's what he wants to eliminate. So he's determined when Messiah was born. He's determined where Messiah was to be born. And so he sends the Magi out. Verse 8 says he asks the wise, in fact, he tells them to go. And he says, Go and search carefully for the child, and when you found him, report to me that I too may come and worship him. He sends them to the town of Bethlehem, and he says, Get his address and bring it back to me, because I want to go there too. Now, if he was in such a big hurry to worship, why didn't he just load up and go with them? If the scribes and the priests that he had called were in such a big hurry about any of this, why hadn't they already been there? They seem to be almost kind of indifferent about the birth of Messiah. But Herod says, I want to go and worship him too. Get me his address, come back and tell me, and then I will go. And we know as we go through the story that he had a plan in mind. Verse 9 said, After hearing the king, the Magi went their way, and the star which they had seen in the east went on before them until it came and stood over the place where the child was. When they saw the star, they rejoiced exceedingly with great joy. After coming into the house, they saw the child with Mary his mother, and they fell to the ground and worshipped him. Then opening their treasures, they presented to him gifts of gold and frankincense and myrrh. And having been warned by God in a dream not to return to Herod, the Magi left for their own country by another way. They get to Bethlehem. They find the house. They're now in a home, no longer in the manger. And what do? They go in and they bowed down and worshiped him as soon as they saw him. They worshiped the child. That's important. They didn't worship anybody else that was there. They worshiped the child, the Messiah, the baby Jesus. And they worshiped him. They rejoice with great joy when they find him. We've seen that similar reaction. The shepherds had great joy. And then they give him gifts. They list 3 gifts here. They're given in verse 11, says they gave him gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. Out of that is where we get the tradition of 3 wise men. We don't know how many. There might have been 3, there might have been 30. We don't know, but we know they have 3 gifts. And when you have a manger scene, it's a lot easier to put 3 wise men in there instead of 30 or 40. So we don't know how many, but they brought gifts to him. They bowed down, they worshiped him. And then it says they got done with what they were doing and they left. But it says God warned them not to go back to Herod, because God knew what Herod was up to. So they took the back road back home, and they bypassed going to Herod. The first response was the wise men came to worship. The second response of Herod was not to worship, but determine where he was so he could get rid of him. He didn't want him around. He wanted no part of Messiah, yet God is ultimately in control of this, and he takes care of the situation. Verse 13 says, Now when the Magi had gone, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream and said, Get up, take the child and his mother and flee to Egypt and remain there until I tell you. For Herod is going to search for the child to destroy him. That's his plan. So what did Joseph do? He got up, took the child and his mother while it was still night, and left for Egypt. He remained there until the death of Herod. This was to fulfill what had been spoken by the Lord through the prophet, Out of Egypt I called my son. So now we know why Herod wanted to find the exact location, why he wanted the address. He didn't want to go worship. He wanted to kill him. And that sounds so harsh until you remember that he killed his own wife and 2 of his own sons, so he's not going to have much remorse over killing one of the Jewish babies. If he'd kill his own children. But God intervenes and warns first the Magi, then he warns Joseph. And he tells Joseph what to do. When we look through the Christmas story, we were reminded of something about Joseph. Joseph was so obedient. You remember when Mary becomes pregnant and Joseph is going to send her away, but the angel comes and says, Joseph, don't do that. Take her as your wife. So he does. The angel tells him what name to give his son. He does. The government comes in and says, you need to go report for the census. So they load up and they head to Bethlehem. Joseph has been very obedient to do the things that he is supposed to do. Perfect obedience. He doesn't, do it part way. He does exactly what he is told to do. Joseph follows his instructions. He follows them to the letter, and that's what he does here. He takes his wife and young son and he goes to Egypt, just as he has been told, and he stays there till Herod dies. Imagine having a newborn and being told you need to get up and leave not only your local town, but in our case, you need to leave your town, your part of the state, in fact, the whole state, in fact, the whole country, and go live in another country, in another culture, and you need to take off and go, and you need to go right now. Imagine what that must have been like for them. If you'll remember, they don't have anything. Didn't take them long to pack because they had very little. When Jesus was presented at the temple, they brought an offering of 2 birds, which was the poor man's offering, because that's all they had. And now he's told to get up and go to another country and to stay there. How's he going to do that? What did the wise men bring? Gold and frankincense and myrrh. gold that could be used to finance the trip to Egypt, to finance their sustenance in Egypt until it was time, and then to finance the trip back. You had to get provisions, you'd have to get food, you'd have to do all those kinds of things. I think it's interesting that one of the gifts that's brought, gold was given to honor the king, but it's also of monetary value. May have been what he used to make this trip. Extraordinary obedience here to do what God had told him. I see a lesson in here for us. Joseph was obedient and faithful to do what God told him. He had nothing, but he still came up with an offering. And God met his need. I think sometimes we can look at faithfulness like that and see on the flip side of it God's provision. We talked about that a little bit in Sunday school this morning, a thing called our daily bread, how God provides. This isn't prosperity. This isn't saying, give this and you'll get rich and God will bless you and all that, but Joseph gave what he had, and then his need was met by God. Joseph is obedient even when it's not comfortable. And I have to ask myself, am I obedient all the time? You know, it's pretty easy to be obedient to something, to practice obedience, to be obedient to a command or anything like that when it's comfortable. But what about when obedience requires us stepping out of our comfort zone, doing something new, going somewhere new, changing something dramatically in our lives? It's a lot harder then, isn't it? Obedience is not always comfortable. Obedience is not always easy. But obedience is always what we are called to practice. And Joseph is a wonderful example of that. And now we see Herod's plan put into action. Verse 16, when Herod saw he'd been tricked by the Magi, because remember, they didn't come back and give him the address, he became very enraged and sent and killed all the male children who were in Bethlehem and all its vicinity from 2 years old and under, according to the time which he had determined from the Magi. Then what had been spoken through Jeremiah the prophet was fulfilled. A voice was heard in Ramah, weeping and great mourning, Rachel weeping for her children, and she refused to be comforted because they were no more. Herod's determined when and where, and he sets out to rid the world of the Messiah. He'd already killed 2 of his own sons, so that's not a big deal for him to do something like that. The Jewish leaders were very apathetic about Jesus. You know, Herod called them and said, where was he to be born? And they're like, well, he was to be born over here. Don't you think they would have gone and checked that out if it was the long-awaited Messiah? They just seemed like they didn't care a whole lot. It's really kind of evidence of the nation at that time and the way that they rejected Messiah when he came. There were some that believed, but for the most part, the nation rejected Messiah. It's interesting, the ones who came to worship him were not the Jewish people. Who were they? They were the Gentiles, the non-Jewish people. They came to bow down and worship him, while the Jewish people, his own people, sat there and said, he was born over here, big deal. Didn't seem to care. We see so many different reactions to Messiah, to Jesus. The wise men reacted with wonder and joy, and they came to worship. When they very first saw the star, they took off to find him. And when they got there, they bowed down and worshiped. When the Jewish leaders heard of his birth, even though it fulfilled so many of their prophecies, they just didn't really care a whole lot. They were kind of indifferent. And then we have Herod. Herod wants to get rid of him. Different reactions from different people. Herod's plan caused anguish and much horror, but it failed because of Joseph's obedience. Joseph, Mary, and Jesus were safe in Egypt, where God had told Joseph to take them. And Joseph stayed there until after Herod died. And the last few verses of this chapter say, when Herod died, an angel of the Lord appeared in a dream to Joseph in Egypt and said, get up, take the child and his mother, and go back to the land of Israel. For those who sought the child's life are dead. So Joseph got up, took the child and his mother, and he came into the land of Israel. But when he heard that Archelaus was reigning over Judah in place of his father Herod, one of the sons he hadn't killed, he was afraid to go there. And Joseph gets another dream. And God says, go to Galilee. Go to the region of Galilee. And he came and lived in a city called Nazareth. This was to fulfill what was spoken through the prophets. He shall be called a Nazarene. Joseph again follows God's instructions and he returns. Herod's son must not have been a whole lot better than him because Joseph didn't want to go to that area. But he was headed there, and then God told him, go somewhere else, and he was obedient. Once again, you've been away for a long time. You come back in the country. Where do you want to go? Your hometown. He said, no, got to go over here. And Joseph did what he was told to do. This wonderful example of obedience. And he gets to Nazareth, and that's where Jesus grew up. We see different reactions to the birth of Jesus, and we can apply that to see different reactions in our world today to Jesus. Some who want to worship him as Messiah. The great amount of people who are just kind of indifferent to him. They could care less. They just don't have any use for him. And then the other group at the other far extreme that wants all reference to him gone, that wants no mention of him made anywhere. 2,000 years later, the same type of reactions to Messiah. And we see again the obedience of Joseph. Dwight Pentecost, who went home to be with the Lord last year. He was 98 years old. Had taught the life of Christ for 60 years at the Philadelphia College of the Bible and then at Dallas Seminary. He had a saying that's stuck with me all these years. He said this, he said, obedience brings blessing. Disobedience brings discipline and perhaps disaster. Something we should keep in mind. We've seen the last few weeks the incredible obedience of Joseph. We see now the different reactions of the world to Jesus that you see every day when you interact with people in the world. They either love Jesus or they really don't want to hear about him, or they really just don't want anything to do with him and hope he'd just go away and they'd never have to hear anything about Christianity again. It's different reactions. We are going to close our service this morning by celebrating the Lord's Supper.